Welcome back. You know, when you filled out your application for graduate school, most of those had a question. Why do you want to be a psychotherapist? And the answer you weren't supposed to say was actually the true one, and that is, you wanted to help people. Certainly, you didn't get into the field for the money. That's never going to be in the cards. Most of us really want to help people. And here's a curious fact. Some of us are better at it than others. In fact, here's what the research says. Differences between therapists consistently account for between 5 and 9% of the variability in treatment outcomes. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, 5 to 9%, that's not very much. Well, if you were getting 5 to 9% in your retirement accounts, you would be plenty happy with that. But 5 to 9% has to be seen as a proportion of the total amount of variance that therapy contributes to outcome. What's that figure? 13%. So 5 to 9% of the 13% is actually a huge number. The point is, the most effective ingredient in psychotherapy is you. And as I said, some therapists seem to be better at it than others. This is one of the things that we began to discover when we started measuring outcomes. You'll recall that we couldn't figure out what led some therapies to be more effective than others. So we began to measure. And when we measured, we started to notice that therapists seemed to account for those differences. And those differences persisted even when researchers did things like controlling the amount of experience a therapist had, their age, their gender, the particular theoretical orientation or model that was used, their social skill level, their professional degree, whether they were a PhD, an MD, a master's level person, or a peer professional, the years of experience, even the time spent conducting therapy. When we hold all those variables constant, still some therapists emerge as better than others. Now, I hope you were curious like I was, wondering what could account for that difference in effect, because the more experienced therapists, the difference isn't small, it's monumental. The best therapists achieve 50% better outcomes and suffer 50% fewer dropouts than their less effective counterparts. So, what's the difference? If it's not all those variables I mentioned, how is it that some therapists are more effective than others? I think you're going to be surprised about what does not make a difference. Studies to date show that there's little to no evidence that traditional professional training leads to better outcomes. This is likely to make you angry if you're still paying off your student loans, but that's just the nature of the beast. There's no difference either between professionals, students, and paraprofessionals or peer supports. There's very little evidence that supervision actually improves treatment outcomes. Now, I know what you might be thinking again. How could supervision not lead to better outcomes? I wondered the same thing too. And yet, that's what the data say. Even though therapists say it's the number 2 contributor in terms of importance to their development as a therapist, it just doesn't make a difference in terms of our outcomes. And as I've said, experience, being here in the field, growing gray at the temples, wearing tweed coats rather than the latest chic clothing, just doesn't make a difference in terms of outcome. And continuing education, well, you're all mandated to attend continuing education to maintain your license. There is virtually no research about that. So what does work? Well, here's what we do know. Clinicians who routinely obtain feedback on the progress and the status of the relationship with their individual clients have outcomes that are much better and dropout rates that are much less. In fact, numerous studies actually confirm this now in the research literature. That process is known as feedback-informed treatment, and it means monitoring on a routine basis at the beginning of each session and the end of each session the client's progress and the status of the relationship with them. When therapists do so, the research evidence indicates that clients stay in therapy, outcomes improve, the cost of treatment is actually reduced, and client complaints also decrease. That means clients' complaints to licensing boards, etc. Since we first began investigating feedback-informed work, back at the turn of the millennium, the research literature has not only grown, but the popularity of the approach is also increased. It's now being implemented by practitioners and agencies around the world. Thousands visit my website every week to download the measures, and agencies and governments around the world are putting funding into helping clinicians implement this in their work. Now, if you're like me, then you probably work very hard at staying in touch with your clients. You're probably asking them for feedback on a routine basis. But let's think about this from a medical perspective. If your physician asks you about your blood pressure, unless you have a cuff at home, do you really have anything of value to offer? The physician doesn't use their judgment. They actually use a measurement tool to find out whether or not the treatment that they prescribe to help you with your blood pressure is actually making a difference. This is the paradox of feedback. When they are asked, most therapists say they value feedback, that supervision is important to them, and another thing they say is that as experience lengthens in the field, the primary way that they learn how to do therapy is to listen more carefully to their clients. Interestingly though, even though therapists think they're seeking feedback, the studies suggest actually that they don't. In other words, the therapist experience of asking for feedback is quite different from the client's experience of being asked for feedback, unless there's some formal process, a ritual so to speak, where time is taken for the client to complete a form and a discussion follows. Clients just don't see the feedback in the same way that therapists do. So let me tell you about a little study that we did when we first began doing the research on feedback-informed treatment. We developed the two scales, the ORS and the SRS, and we were teaching about them in workshops around the world. It wasn't uncommon for clinicians to say, what I've already mentioned here, I asked for feedback. What's the advantage of using these two very simple measures? And I would dutifully lay out the data, and they would say, well, I sort of do that anyway. So we did a study. We asked clinicians to use the measures in one group, and in another group we simply said, you ask for feedback in your way, but you must ask for feedback. The clinicians actually had to tick a form in that condition that indicated that they had asked for feedback. At the conclusion of the study, we had a graduate student begin looking at the videos because the sessions were recorded. She came to us and she said, I can't find out where the clinicians are asking for the feedback in the non-formal feedback condition. We said, let us look. We were the PhDs after all. She was just a student. We started looking at the videos ourselves. We couldn't see where the therapists were asking for feedback either. So we called the therapist in. We pointed where they'd ticked on the box saying that they had asked for feedback and asked, where have you done it? Show us in the video. Invariably, they would point to something that we couldn't even think of as feedback, as a sign that they were asking for or being attentive to the client's experience in therapy. The point was, without some formal way of asking, therapists thought they were following and asking for feedback when they weren't. So, over and over again, as I travel around the world and meet clinicians, they tell me a very similar story. They start using the measures, and more than one or two clients will say, this is interesting. I've been in therapy before, and never has a therapist actually asked me for feedback in this way. The other thing that clients say is how important it was to be able to talk about when the therapist misunderstood them, even though the client might not experience this as a big negative event in the therapy. Being encouraged to share even when therapy wasn't just perfect enabled them to be more engaged in the treatment process. Over the last decade or so, we've really begun to finesse the feedback process, helping therapists learn how to use the measures in the most effective way to get the feedback that they need to keep clients fully engaged and on track towards achieving their goals. Now, although we're learning this, and while feedback is becoming a big movement, generally referred to as routine outcome monitoring over the past decade, it's only very recently that regulatory bodies have begun mandating gathering feedback information on a formal basis. Effective January 1st, 2018, just under a year ago, both the U.S. Joint Commission and SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, revised their requirements to include mandatory monitoring of clients, here's a quote, progress in achieving their care, treatment, or service objectives. So, if you haven't already done so, the first step here is to go to my website and download the scales. You may have already started to use them with your clients, but I want to share with you what we've learned about the most effective way to use the scales. And it starts by creating a culture of feedback in your work. Clients have to really feel that it's in their best interest to tell you that they need something more from the therapeutic experience. So we have two measures. The ORS. This one you're going to give at the beginning of your session, each time you meet with your clients. And here's what I recommend saying. Number one, that you work a little differently than this client may be accustomed to. I don't know about you, but more and more, the people that I meet in my practice are not therapy virgins. They've been to therapy multiple times. That's why they're back in your office. They're trying to get the help that they really need and want. So I say to my clients, I work a little differently than you may be accustomed to. I'm really interested in making sure that you get what you come for. That's the second thing I say. The third thing I say is, if what I know how to do is going to be of help to you, then you should start to see some movement, some progress, sooner rather than later. I don't tell my clients this because I'm trying to build hope and expectancy, although it may serve that end. I'm telling them this because that's what the research says. I'm not saying that they have to be all better, but that they should start to see some movement. But I add critically in number 3, that if they don't, that's okay, because the measures are designed to tell me when what I do isn't helping them and isn't working. And that's good feedback to have, because if I learn about that early enough in the process, then I can adjust what I do. And if that adjustment doesn't result in a difference, I also want to know that, because then I can ally other resources in the service of their change. I finish by saying that if what I do doesn't work, then I'll work with them to find someone else or someplace else that does. That's the way I introduce the ORS. I do that again at the very beginning of the first visit, and I remind them of those ideas as we progress in therapy from session to session. At the end of each visit, I take out the SRS. This particular tool is designed to help people give me feedback about their experience in the visit that day. So I say, once again, I'm really interested in your feedback. I am not interested in perfect scores, I say. 10 out of 10 doesn't mean very much to me. Life's not perfect, neither am I. And I warn them, sometimes there can be a thing or two that don't seem particularly problematic, so much so that since everything else seemed to go okay, they don't think it's worth bringing up. I lean forward and I say, bring it up. This is the only occasion in life where you can have a suit of clothing perfectly tailored to you. So I want to know anything that pinches or doesn't feel just right. And then I hand them the measure. The point of this is for me to create that environment where the clients can feel free to tell me how to improve the work that we're doing. In the process, their engagement deepens and the possibility of arriving at a successful outcome improves. All right, so don't wait. Go to the website, download the measures, rewind this video, and listen to how I introduce the scales. Perhaps you're wondering if you should do that. That will be the subject of the next video.